Well, first of all, I always enjoy coming to speak with the individuals here at CAECO, and I'm glad that the judge didn't give me a long introduction because I don't like those. But I want to take a few moments, and I think what I've always done with this group is really kind of open it up to questions because I think you all like to ask me questions more than you want to hear me talk about a few things. But first of all, let me talk about your leadership group. And I see Brian down here, and I want to say, they've done a really good job. And I know Mr. Nicholson's on his last days as well. Not sure where he is. There he is. Sometimes it's hard to see where everybody sits, but I truly want to compliment them on the work they did in this past session. And I know to some individuals, workers' comp reform is kind of a tough subject to touch, but truly, they stepped up to the plate. We had a common sense reform that you really didn't hear a lot of arguments about. Yeah, there's always going to be some. But to the CAECO group and their insurance and what it goes back to cost the counties, how much it saved them by having some common sense approaches. An approach that we really need to take in trying to resolve a lot of problems is bringing all the people in the room to try to come together with some solutions. And that's what we did. We brought individuals from the unions and laborers, the trial bar, people who represented CAECO, the League of Cities, KEME, individuals who had the business interest. And when you look at it, we came with a bill that when we started 2 years ago, went through the process, through these meetings, that very few people complained about because we put actually more money, what we call the indemnity side, more money in the injured person's pocket, but we reduced the exposure because of some simple solutions that if you haven't treated in 15 years, then why do you continue to have coverage if it was really a work-related injury? So that was able to free up some cash and what you have to keep in reserves, and it's just kind of a common sense approach. And truly, I've done workers' comp for close to 30 years. I represent the injured worker, and I've probably done over 100 cases. So I know what was fair and what was not. But your all's group really stepped up on big issues like this, and it made a difference. It made a difference in what you all have in cost, which if you all have reduced costs, then you've got more money to go back into your county governments, which, Judge, means you might build more roads and truly do the things that government is supposed to do for the people they represent. I want to say something also that I just heard. I just came back, and I want to make clear. The judge is in, I'm going to look at Judge Moore, he's in one of the areas that's one of the most populated areas in the state. And I know there's always this rural-urban divide. And I come from Manchester, Clay County, my hometown, population, I think, 1,200. And I want to say this about Northern Kentucky, Lexington, and Louisville, and for all the other individuals out here. But we also need individuals from Northern Kentucky, Lexington, and Louisville to understand the synergies of what goes on in this state. And I've used our motto, united we stand and divided we fall, quite often. And I'm going to say Northern Kentucky. You can apply it to Louisville or Lexington. But because of the population base and what we do there and what we hear, and it's always said, well, Northern Kentucky sends X number of dollars to Frankfort, or Lexington sends X number of dollars to Frankfort, or Louisville sends X number of dollars to Frankfort, but we don't get those dollars back. I want to tell you from just a personal standpoint, we need those regions to be strong. We need Northern Kentucky to be strong. We need Lexington to be strong. We need Louisville to be strong because they have missions well beyond the geographic confines of their area. For me personally, I have 3 children that went to the University of Louisville. I paid tuition up at the University of Louisville. Many of us go to events, as we are going to go to the CSG in Northern Kentucky or the SLC, or you go to the State Fair at the Exposition Center, Mr. Nicholson, and it draws people from all around the state. These dollars aren't generated just by Northern Kentuckians in Northern Kentucky, or Lexingtonians by Lexingtonians, or Louisvillians by Louisvillians. If you want to look at the University of Kentucky Healthcare Center, 85% of their patient visits come from outside of Fayette County. 85%. 1/4 of our economy is now healthcare. And if you think about that, that's why we need those areas to be strong, because they have the population bases. But we can't be so parochial, so driven by our local areas to not know that we need to elevate everybody in the state. We need to work well, because individuals go from Manchester to Lexington, Manchester to Louisville, Manchester to Northern Kentucky for education, health care, transportation, entertainment, retail. So we have to make sure we don't get into one of these debates about rural and urban, because truly we are the state of Kentucky, and united we stand and divided we fall. So I tell everybody to keep that in mind when we start looking at what we do in this upcoming legislative session. We can't have a strong state if we don't have all parts of our state strong. As to the gas tax and infrastructure, I was quoted, matter of fact, that's why I got here early, so I could hear what people were saying about me. I heard a lot of discussion about what we need to do for infrastructure, and I've been very clear. We do need to update our mechanism for replacing and supplying our infrastructure needs. And just as my phone goes off, it's great to say, when Secretary Thomas talks about how many hybrid cars, electric cars, what's going to happen with the CAFE standards, when I came in 22 years ago, it was a big deal. And you all have heard me say this. It was a big deal for you to have a bag phone. Everybody had a landline, and you had a tax system set up on landlines. And if we had done something small then with cell phones, we'd have had a totally different taxing structure and captured a sector of our society. Now that where you had one landline in your house, you now have 5 cell phones, 1 for me and 4 for my children. So they never really get off the payroll. Anybody that's got teenage children, don't ever think they get off the payroll. But truly, that's why I say we've got to look at a different mechanism, because the faster you acquire knowledge, or the more knowledge you acquire, the faster you will acquire knowledge. And so as we look at Gardner Lane in Louisville, who now has a charging station on it for 5 vehicles, it's just going to continue to go and be more rapid growth in that area. So do I understand the needs? And I think at this conference a few months ago, maybe a year ago, I came up with some ideas about how do we change and how do we do things using a card and a state license. How does it interact with interstate transportation? Just got back from Canada, speaking with the ambassador, who happens to be a Kentuckian, and they're very much interested in Kentucky transportation. Why? Because so much of the products that they produce come through Kentucky. I think Juva stated that within a day's drive, we're within 60% of the population. We are strategically positioned to make sure that we are kind of the hub, and so many routes that go through here will make us the hub for manufacturing. So there are so many ideas that we have to deal with, so many different alternatives, but it can't be exclusively an increase in a gas tax, because all the things I've talked about, we're going to have a different mode and different ways of transportation 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road. That's just reality. You're seeing it. It's just what happened with cell phones and communications, that we don't have the same type of communications. And I will tell you, in Manchester, sometimes it's really good not to have a landline and have a cell phone, because if you're on the right side of the hill, nobody knows how to call you because you don't have service. And it's good to get away from, as I think Mr. Inman said, the numerous conversations and requests for meetings that you get in the positions that we hold. But I see this as something as a very large discussion. But I also want to say this group, along with the League of Cities, is going to have to go out and make the case, along with other individuals, about the need. And it can't be expected that the legislature itself alone can sit there and explain to the constituencies throughout the state what the need is and how do we address it. Because you all have more direct contact with individuals in your areas to explain. and I will use back home in my area how one bridge being declared deficient and being dropped to a 3-ton limitation means that a school bus can't run across it. And because that school bus can't run across the Buzzard Bridge, and that's truly its name, the Buzzard Branch Bridge, there's about 70 kids up there that either have to walk down to the bridge or the bus has to take a 12-mile loop around to pick up those children, then come all the way back, actually passing another school in another school district. Things like that have to be explained why we have to get our infrastructure in order. Because at times it's more costly to do nothing than it is to do something. But it has to be a smart process, a process that knows that we're going to transition to future transportation needs. And I agree with Mr. Inman. You know, we're going to have to look at things. How do you deal with road mileage? Because that's truly what we're talking about, is an electric car who pays no tax actually puts the same amount of use on a road that a car that uses tax does, but they're getting a free use of it. And that group, that sector, that constituency is going to continue to grow, and it will grow faster as we continue to gain more knowledge. And I think I was quoted talking about how Tesla had just been ordered 125 vehicles from UPS. That's going to continue. It's going to be the realities of the future. So we have to be smart about what we're doing. And we can't just say that we're going to rely on the systems we've had in the past, because they just do not work in this day and age we're in. As to the upcoming session, I want to just touch on some things briefly. We did some tax modernization. We changed the mechanisms, and I know that a lot of people tried to cast this that, well, you were taxing shots on Fluffy, the dog, at the local veterinarians. Well, that's discretionary spending, and I understand that. And if you want to have discretionary spending, then you won't get taxed. But what a lot of people didn't talk about is how we became more competitive because we reduced our corporate tax and our personal tax about 15%. So we start looking better to businesses and communities, and that's why you have seen record investment in so many people wanting to come to Kentucky. And you have to move those at a parallel, because if you don't, then you'll game one side or the other on how you incorporate and you do things. So they're going to have to pretty much stay the same. There's some other things we're going to have to look at, and people, and this is a good group, people are going to have to understand when we come out with a bank franchise tax. I'm going to look at Judge Moore again, because he's one of the individuals that's most at risk. Anybody around Ashland, anybody around Louisville, Henderson, Southern Borders, this bank franchise tax, and people are going to say, well, that's a great tax relief for the banks. Let me tell you what happened. And this is Tracy Farmer's bank. And I think most people know who Tracy Farmer is. Always been a long-time Democrat supporter. I enjoy some conversations over the past with Mr. Farmer, but he just got bought out. Why did he get bought out? Because the West Virginia bank, who has a tax rate on reserves, is only about 3.5 or 4%. What Kentucky has in its code is close to 13%. So when you sit there and think, well, I can go into Kentucky, and these mandated reserves under Dodd-Frank and other state legislation that are required to be held by banks in Kentucky is taxed at a 13% rate, a 3% rate in West Virginia, I can buy that bank out. And so banks that are on the border are subject to be bought out. And then what they're going to do, those mandated reserves, they're going to move them to be in compliance with state law and federal law to the state with the lower tax rate. Because dollars and wealth are movable. They're fungible, easily moved in this day and age. So the 10% differential means that we lose our local bank, and they can take that 10% differential cash flow and afford to make the payments on the bank. That's why you saw Farmers Bank in Frankfort get purchased by a West Virginia bank. And then what happens there? Because they consolidate the labor force and the functions, that you lose 50 jobs because they lay those people off in Frankfort, Kentucky because they're streamlining. So when you hear all this discussion about tax reform and why we need to do it, it gets very difficult to explain in a soundbite society. And I give you that because it's the same thing that's going to have that type of discussion when you start talking about infrastructure and how we move forward on infrastructure and individuals knowing it. Because you all have the direct contact with the constituencies, the individuals back in your hometowns that you can explain this to. Because I will be upfront about it. If you poll changing taxes, it's not one of the most favorite things you're going to see on poll returns. Make no doubt. I've seen it. I've watched it. But sometimes you have to make tough decisions. And this is going to have to be one, and hopefully, and I'll say this, I think I stood here back in the spring and said, I don't think the Senate's going to lose any seats in the fall election, and I don't think the House would lose that many. Because people realize that we've got some tough problems that we have to deal with in this state. And it's going to have everybody's support from the political spectrum to really stand up and say, yeah, there are tough problems. There are issues we have to resolve. There are issues we have to fund. And it needs to be in a bipartisan way. It needs to be Republicans and Democrats. Whatever governor is here a year from now or 2 years from now, because and I don't say this out of arrogance or anything else, with supermajorities in both chambers and a presidential year next year, the legislature is not likely to change. That's just reality. It's not likely to change. So we need everybody to step up to the table and explain what needs to be done. That there needs to be conversation, that one side just doesn't sit out. I saw that Senator McConnell said it's an interesting time when you have bipartisan and split control in Washington, because then you have to come together and share pain equally. Well, we don't need to get to that point in this day and age here in Kentucky. We need to step up now, and everybody needs to come to the table and not just say, well, we need to do this. We need to start talking about specifics. It's easy to say we can do economic development, but what does it take to do economic development? It means building infrastructure in this state. Adequate infrastructure that even people from Canada are looking to us, because so much moves through this state. And if we want to move forward, these are the types of discussions we're going to have. To this group, I always appreciate coming and talking to you all. I think you all have a great grasp of what goes on, and you all can be very good spokesmen. And again, I want to congratulate your leadership group, because I think they've done a really good job of dealing with your all's issues and advocating for you in Frankfort and making us understand what happens on the ground with governments at the local level. And so with that, I will say thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity. And Judge, I don't know if I've used all my time or not. If there's any questions, I would gladly accept them.
We've got about 5 minutes.
Okay. Judge says I have 5 minutes. Anybody got a question? I see somebody moving in the back. Okay, I'll start here while you're moving, and I'll repeat the question if they can't hear it in the back. Well, and I appreciate that question. Consumption tax is what we have moved to, because we are reducing a production tax. You know, every month under the way the state taxes right now, your production is going to be taxed. Well, we reduced that by dropping the rates from 6% to 5% and went to a consumption tax on doing things like veterinarian services and things of that nature, because if you don't want to spend in that area, you won't get taxed purely on consumption. You have the choice of where you want to be taxed. And we need to continue to change that model, so every month when you go home, Your check is going to have more in it, then you'll get to determine where you spend and how you'll be taxed. And the states in the South that have done that, particularly Tennessee, have seen huge growth because people like that opportunity of knowing, well, we won't be taxed for what we produce, it's what we consume. And that, to me, is the fairest of all taxes, because if you're the wealthier, you're going to spend more. Therefore, you're going to be taxed more. Now, there's certain areas we're going to have to exempt, but if you want to be competitive, and also economists, and I will say this, my undergraduate was a minor in economics. Economists will tell you that relying more on a sales tax, a consumption tax, is by far a more stable and standard tax that you can count on, instead of a production income tax. Do you need it? Yes. Do you need property tax? Yes. You need more than one leg on the stool. But your basic needs are going to have to be coming from a consumption tax, and it is by far more reliable than any other tax we have. And to be competitive in a day and age where wealth and money are so fungible and so movable, then we have to go to that type of tax rate, because you will see people will actually move their residence. That's why you see, one of the reasons you see Florida growing so much and people establishing a residency in Florida, it's because of their tax code. You see people establishing their residence in Tennessee or Oklahoma because they can do that because they want to have favorable tax advantages. And that's the type of direction we're going. And that's why, even though it did positive generation of revenue, because we have to deal with this pension issue, and no matter what rulings come out of the courts, we're still going to have to deal with pension issues. But we had to do it. But the people who rate taxes and your tax code said that we went from 33rd to like 18th in being more competitive in our tax structure, because people get to choose where they're taxed.
President
Yes, sir.
Stivers, I believe we have time for one more, and I think he's ready. So, yes.
I'm Gary Gardner, magistrate from Hart County. You mentioned a word a while ago, and I was not going to ask this question or make a comment, but you mentioned polling. At my coffee group every morning, which is made up of retired people, college educated people, loggers, their consensus is raise the sales tax. A governor was even approached by my judge yesterday, and he had a number when he told him 1%. 2% is just phenomenal. We've got to fix these things. You guys know that. I think it was very clear last week in the election that Kentucky feel like we're on the right track. You don't have to comment on this, but I think if you took a consensus, a polling, as you said, in this group, that this group would be overwhelmingly in favor of a sales tax. Tennessee has 9 3/4, and you can't keep them out of Gatlinburg and Clarksville and other places in Tennessee. So just think about that. Appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for your time.
And you're going back to the whole argument on a consumption tax versus a production tax, going to a sales tax instead of an income tax. And truly, most of us believe that is the model we need to go to. We can't go exclusively to that, but that is the direction we need to go. And I don't disagree with you on that, but we also have to make sure in this day and age we don't run off businesses. And I want to conclude with this. If you want to know what running off businesses mean, come to my hometown. Come to anybody in the east of my hometown of Clay County. We lost 7,000 jobs. Our tax base, because we lost whoever had a tax for wages, anybody who had a property tax that was pretty significant, anybody who had children in school, all these things started dropping because we lost 7,000 jobs. People started moving. We had an out-migration over the last few years of 40,000 people in eastern Kentucky. So what happens? We lose the occupational tax. Property tax starts going down because property is devalued. We built schools 10 years ago based on a funding stream that was based on that property tax, and now we don't have it. And average daily attendance starts dropping at $4,000 per student. So when you lose 100 students a year for 3 years straight, you've lost 300 students times 4,000. So you're having a hard time with your school systems. Why? Because we didn't create the economic base of jobs, and it's all about creating jobs. If you don't, you'll see what happens. Look at Eastern Kentucky and how we've had the outmigration and how it is so difficult, and we have to replace those jobs. And if we don't, we're still going to continue to be in the hole we're in. So with that, again, I appreciate it, Judge.
Yeah.
Somebody else has got another
If
question.
you have time, let's take
All
one
right,
more.
I will. I'll
One-
gladly
one
do it.
more. We're okay.
Real quick, John Kaywood, Masters, Boyle County. It's interesting you talk about businesses because what really hurts small business is the tax inventory. Is that still on the table and still being discussed in Frankfurt?
Yes. You know, and again, it needs to, you can't, we tried to take parts that we could deal with and get through because you need a good explanation of what happens with the tax code and how, where you push in on one side, it'll pop out like the balloon on the other side. And truly, if we don't create, and I know people will say, well, you're taking care of big business and everything else. I want to know, how many people have a 401k or they're in the state retirement system? Teachers. $22 billion investment in the teacher retirement system is in the stock market. We've got to have our business community do well. They've got to create those jobs at base. Small business has to do this. And we have to create a tax code that doesn't run them out, because that's where we get the taxes to pay for everything. And the bigger you build that base, you build that strong economic base, the more money we're going to have at lower rates, because you've always heard me say this: expand the base and lower the rates. That's how you have a good economy and a growing state. Thank you all so much.